So this tutorial is an introduction into ggplot2, which is a plotting system for R. By the end of this video, you should have a basic idea of the grammar of ggplot2 and how it works. So for this tutorial and for the other materials on the edX page, a lot of the examples are going to use a data set called diamonds, which is built into the ggplot2 package. So the diamonds data set has 54,000 rows, each one representing a diamond, and there are 10 variables, which include price, carat, cut, color, clarity, and you can read about it here. Things to note: price and carat are continuous variables, whereas color and cut are categorical, so keep that in mind when you watch the rest of this video. So to build a graph in ggplot2, there are three basic components that you need. The first is the data set, so in this case we're going to use diamonds. The second is something called an aesthetic mapping, which describes how you want to map the variables in the dataset to visual properties in the graph. So the most basic aesthetic mapping is to specify which variables we want on the x and y axis. So in this case, we want the price of the diamond to be on the y-axis, and we want the carat of the diamond to be on the x-axis. And the last component that we need is something called a geom, which is short for geometric object. And this specifies how we want the data to be visualized on the graph. So in this case, we specified that we want it to be points, but we can also have bars, lines, and these create the different types of plots. So we can use two different functions to build a graph. There's Ggplot, which stands for quick plot, and this is used for creating a complete plot given the data, geom, and aesthetic mappings. And this function is supplied with many defaults, so you can quickly create a plot, and notice how within the function itself we've specified all three of these things, and we can create this plot below. The other function that we can use is the ggplot function. And notice how the syntax looks different. Inside the ggplot function, we've specified the data and the aesthetic mapping, and then we've added this thing called geompoint. So for the rest of this tutorial, I'm going to be talking about ggplot. Ggplot allows the user to have more control and flexibility over creating the plot. So this is what we're going to use for the rest of the tutorial. So the way to think about the ggplot function is that we're creating this base that we can add layers to. So the most basic layer that we can add on is the geompoint, which specifies which type of representation we want of the data. So if we just type ggplot into the console, we'll get this blank screen. And then once we specify the data set and the variables within the ggplot function, we get this. So you can see that we have the price and the carat labeling the x and y axis, but we don't have any points. And so once we add the geompoint layer, we get a proper plot. So the great thing about these layers is that we can specify the aesthetic mapping and the data set within each layer. So that means I can specify the aesthetic mapping and data set in the geompoint function or in the ggplot function, and in both of these cases I get the exact same plot down here. So you've only seen the point geom, which creates a scatter plot. But there are various other geoms, like we can create a box plot, a dot plot, we can display a smooth density estimate, we can have a line, we can add a fitted line, we can add segments, and we can have bars. So here's an example of the diamonds dataset where we have x, where we have the x being carat and the y being price, except this time we've specified that we want the geom to be a box, not points. So now I'm going to talk more about the aesthetic function and aesthetic mapping because it's kind of confusing. But basically, aesthetic mapping, as I said earlier, describes how we want to map variables onto the plot. So we've only seen mapping of variables onto the x and y axis, but we can also map variables to the color of the points, the fill of the points, the shape of the points, and the size. So, for example, here we have the exact same plot I made earlier, except here I've mapped the cut of the diamond onto the color. And here we can see now that the color of the points corresponds to the cut of each diamond. Similarly, I can do this with a continuous variable, depth instead, and here we get like this bar with a gradient that specifies the depth of the diamond. So here's the example applied to the iris dataset where we've mapped species onto the color of the points. We can also do that with shape. We can do that with alpha, which is the opacity, and we can do that with size. So the thing to note is that different geomes have different aesthetic mappings. So for example, for the histogram below, we only specify a mapping of a variable onto the x-axis, otherwise we'll get an error. This is because the histogram only takes one variable and shows the distribution of that variable. Another example is if we want to map a variable onto the type of line that it is, the graph has to have lines. So it only works for the geome line. Another thing to note is that the aesthetic function is for mapping variables onto the plot. So if I want to make the points on the plot blue, I don't specify the color inside the aesthetic function. I specify the color inside the geome point. So notice how these two are different. So far we've seen the basics of the graph, which is the ggplot, and then ggplot where we specify the aesthetic mapping, and then when we can specify the geome type. But we can also add layers that add annotations to the graph. They can add statistical transformations on top of the graph. We can add a layer that controls the scales, which controls the mapping between the data and the aesthetics. So that would be things like the x and y axis limits. And if we want to change the color of these points, we can add a layer that creates facets. And we can change the non-data components of the plot using a theme. So this would include changing the background color or the color and font of your axis labels. So here's a really ridiculous looking graph where we've added every single type of layer possible. We have annotations, we have fitted lines, we've got a background color, we've got facets, we've got everything. And this graph was created by just adding on different layers to this really simple graph that we saw earlier. And so here's the code for the most ridiculous graph ever. And here we can see the really basic graph. And then we've added things like a layer that controls the colors of the scale. We can change the axis, x and y axis limits. We've added labels. We've added a fitted line. We've added an annotation. So now you should have a basic idea of how ggplot works and the general syntax to creating a really basic graph. You should also be familiar with the steps forward to creating and modifying a more complicated graph.